If you study the history of feudalism, the system dominant in the Western world before capitalism arrives, right? 1,000 years, 500 AD, roughly, collapse of Rome, Renaissance, 1500, 1600, arrival of capitalism, roughly. Then in those 1,000 years of feudalism, you see a remarkable evolution. Feudalism starts as a highly decentralized. It's the opposite of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was a concentrated empire with a headquarters in Rome, blah, 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 blah. Feudalism is dispersed, not hierarchical, lots of little lords and serfs who are their own little entities. You know, modern countries like France, Germany, Italy come much later. They had to be created. They weren't there before. Rome Empire falls apart. It breaks into many, many little pieces. Yet, by the end of feudalism, by the 15th, 16th century, what you have are something called absolute monarchies. The opposite of early feudalism. Highly concentrated, state-dominated feudal societies. They even had to take one of the feudal lords, who used to be many, and make them get, like competition. They fought each other, they absorbed each other, and eventually one becomes the number one feudal lord who takes the name king. That's what kings are. The biggest, bestest feudal lord. You know, the absolute monarchies, they're the ones that created the Versailles Gardens. If you ever visited Paris, you go to the tourist thing outside of the city in Versailles, spectacular, palace, gardens. These were very rich, highly organized, they produced the great painters, the great chateaus that you visit to this day. Why am I telling you this? I'll quote Marx. Marx wrote, "No system disappears before all the possible forms of it have been tried and utilized as far as they could be. Then we get the next system." Feudalism went through a decentralized, through several steps, to a highly centralized. It went from a purely agricultural to lots of cities in medieval Europe. It handled urbanization. It went from no trade, everything self-sufficient, to lots of trade, right? Capitalism, likewise. It goes from the small capitalist with a dozen workers to the big modern corporation. From a local corporation to a national corporation, to a multinational corporation, to a global corporation. Why am I telling you this? Here's another way capitalism evolved. It started as a thoroughly private enterprise undertaking. Coming out of feudalism, there were a few of these people who set up little businesses, but they had no relationship to the government. That was all feudalism. That was the king. He didn't care about them. They were the opposite. If anything, he went and taxed them. They didn't like it, and so they fought back, and they got little privileges of not being taxed, of not being regulated, little walled towns where they could be free. Why am I telling you this? Because over time, as they grew, they stopped being angry about the state and realized, maybe we'd be better off trying to control this state. Don't get rid of it. Control it so it works for us, not for the feudals, which is where the state comes from, and not for the working class, we don't want that, but for us. We want the government for the employer. And so they needed to develop the government to give it the capacity to do that. On the one hand, for example, the capacity that if the workers revolt, remember, workers are many, employers are few. U.S. Census right now classifies 3% of the American people as employers. The other 97% are not. Okay, that's a problem for employers because they're a small minority. They need to control the government to make sure the majority doesn't crush them. So now they need a strong government with troops and police and army and a judicial system. So the worker who wants to rebel gets punished and stuck in a jail or fined or Then they need also help because other capitalists in other countries eye them with jealousy. So we need a navy and we need Slowly the government has to be built up. You don't trust it, you don't like it, but you have to do it. In that scenario, what China is not what you said. China is a recognition, as we talked a little bit before, that capitalism needs to go through all the phases it can to survive. It adjusted the private quality of its beginnings by allowing the state to take a bigger and bigger role. It didn't do it in a straight line. The great crash of 1929 brought the government in massively to save capitalism. But in the aftermath of World War II, they pushed the government back out. That's what you and I have lived our lives in a period when they pushed the government out. In a way, Mr. Trump is the end of that period. When we pushed he'd bring the government back in. But here's the crucial thing for China. We've had the government minimal, early capitalism. We've had the government brought in, Keynes, the Depression, and then this thing called Scandinavian socialism, which seemed to mean a regulatory government, a taxing government, lots of social services produced by the government, but basically private capitalism for the bulk of the goods and services in society. So that's another form. Then we had the Soviet Union. And the Soviet Union called itself socialist, like the Scandinavians do, but they meant something very different. They meant the government takes over and runs the enterprise. And they said that was socialism. But I would argue, as you've heard me, I think, before, that it isn't. It wasn't socialism. I don't dispute. You can call it whatever you want. But they never changed the employer-employee structure of enterprises. Small group of people, the owner, the director, the board of directors, whatever you want to call it, overseeing and ordering about a mass of workers who are employees. They have very little power, they have all the power. These people fire those, not the other way around. These people direct those, not the other way around. These people produce a surplus that they get, not the other way around. In other words, this is a highly structured arrangement. For me, that's capitalism. And that was there when capitalism was small and had a few workers, and it's there with a major corporation today. It's there whether the private people do it or whether the government does it. So for me, we're still working out all the ways you can have capitalism if you understand it as the employer-employee relationship in production. Then China is simply the latest experiment in yet another form. It's not private capitalism, where you might take the example Britain and the United States. It's not the Soviet Union, no private capitalism, all government does everything. The in-between, Scandinavian, with a little government and mostly private. And now the Chinese, 50-50, with a super powerful state and Communist Party on top. That's a wrinkle. But that wrinkle has been more productive in a shorter amount of time than any of the others. Just like the absolute monarchies were the most effective spectacular achievements of feudalism. So I'm not surprised. I think the reason China is ahead is it figured out that form of capitalism which could get it out of poverty, which was its number one goal. 100 years of humiliation of China, was it because it was poor, backward technologically, underdeveloped, like the whole global South, like all of Africa, like most of Asia, like most of Latin America. The name of the game for them was, above all else, not the struggle of capitalism and socialism. The leaders were worried about that. For the mass of people, how to get out of my poverty, all that meant, and begin to live life. The Chinese Communist Party understood that, in part because of their differences with the Soviet Union stuff that we talked about. And they understood that's the way we're going to try to do it. With all the risks, all the possibilities of failure, we're going to do a hybrid of 50. We're going to let the private go under our control. Meanwhile, keep our control by having half the economy right under our thumb. That's how we're going to do it. And at this moment, the year 2025, there is no contest anymore. They look at it this way. Europe had 500 years to get ready to compete with the United States. They failed. All hot technology in the world today comes from the United States or China. Europe, nothing. Look, there's no comparable Apple or Microsoft or BYD. BYD, the electric Chinese, they're on the roads of Europe because they don't have a 100% tariff. We do. So
100%.
100%. Mr. Trump put it up to 27.5%, and Mr. Biden raised it to 100%. So if you want to buy a BYD electric car, best in the world, cheapest in the world, $30,000, get a car. But that's what it'll cost. They'll ship you a car from China. They ship all over the world. I mean, all of that's taken care of. They're a very, very big and powerful company. By the way, there's an American who has a big piece of it, owns a big piece of BYD. His name is Warren Buffett.
Smart, canny guy.
Yeah, not held back by stupid leftover Cold War nonsense. Never was. Anyway, BYD can't bring a car here because the $30,000 car, which I would buy tomorrow if I could, I have to give 100% tax to Uncle Sam. Another 30. So for me, the car costs $60,000, not 30. And that's why I don't buy any, because I can buy a $40,000 or $50,000 electric car from GM or Ford or Tesla or somebody else. It's not as good, but I don't have it. There's no tariff. Anyway, these situations mean that Mr. Musk and the United States are more and more looked at as a problem to contain, a little bit like Soviet communism looked to Americans. And the Chinese, in my judgment, are on the cusp, as we are in the United States, although for completely different reasons, given our very different situations. We're on the cusp of discovering what European feudalism discovered, that the highest achievement, capitalism in China as this hybrid, is also the last achievement. Now the Louis in France, who built Versailles, were the same family of Louis who ended up on the guillotine with their heads chopped off. I'm, of course, not suggesting anything remotely like that could or would ever happen here. Pause for effect. But the point is, now comes the question, what do we need to do better than what the Chinese have done? What's the next stage? How will people define the problems that the Chinese have and will have? Even the Chinese, and they're very wise about that, they understand their system has problems. Different from what they used to have. Thank God, they're much better off than they used to be, but they have all kinds of economic and other problems. Here's my prediction. These problems will, sooner or later, and I hope it's sooner, be addressed by daring to relearn Marx's lesson. Take a look at how you organize production. The notion that you have to have a few people at the top who run the show and a mass of people underneath who do the work is your problem. You've got to get rid of that. It's a little bit like understanding that for the centuries that there was slavery, there were all kinds of people who understood those slave systems had a problem. And there were all kinds of people who understood, let's solve the problem this way. Give the slave a better diet. Give the slave some more clothing. Put the slave in a decent house. Stop beating the slave. Don't sell the wife against the husband. Blah, blah, blah. And then there were people who said, no, you ain't going to solve your problem that way. You know what your problem is? The master-slave relationship. That's got to go. That's me. I'm just doing that now. It's that relationship that has to go. It's done. That was Marx's point. Poor fellow. Back in the 19th century, 150 years ago, he tried to get that across. Marx made mistakes. Marx is no saint, none of that. But he was very smart. And he set himself the problem, how do you do better than capitalism? And he spent a lifetime trying to figure it out, and he ended up with this conclusion, in my judgment. And I'm open to interpretations. Very Hegelian. The problem of capitalism is itself. It's not this or that. It's not get the workers a bigger wage. Stop. It's like getting the slave a better diet. Stop! Of course, we are in favor of a better diet for the slave. We're decent people. But that's not the problem. The problem is slavery. And the problem is capitalism. The problem, you have a tiny group of people who make all the decisions. Guess what? They're going to take the money and be the wealthy people, the top 10%, aren't they? Everywhere, all the time. And every few years we'll have a war on the poverty, which we seem unable to overcome. Now, why might that be? Look at the taboo in our culture, right up to this minute. You can look at almost anything, but not that economic system. We will criticize our education system. We will criticize our transportation system. We even criticize institutions like marriage, like heterosexuality. But criticize the employer-employee doesn't occur to anyone. Well, 20 years ago, it didn't occur to anyone to question sexism, or in many parts of the country, racism. There comes a time when in history it becomes possible to say, hey, this is outrageous, we won't tolerate this. That's going to come for capitalism. And my guess is it's a crapshoot whether it comes in the dying capitalism of the West or the rising capitalism of the East. My guess it's going to happen in both of them. And wherever it happens first, it'll be infectious on the other. Because the idea will be the problems we face now are finally those which will allow us to ask the question, might the solution to these problems be changing the organization of the workplace from a hierarchical top-down to, dare I say, a democratic arrangement in which all the people at the workplace get together, talk it out, and then have a vote. One person, one vote. After we've looked at all the technical and other aspects, after we've asked the opinions of those who have the technical information we need to make an informed decision. I remind people, all the key decisions in major corporations are made by a board of directors, most of whom have no technical expertise whatsoever. They bring in the specialists who explain to them, as is needed to make the decision, what the technical ramifications. When I explain how a democratic workplace is to be there, the sweeper can make a decision like the heart surgeon in a hospital. Sure he can. Those decisions that are technically complicated, the heart surgeons have to explain what they know. And the sweeper tells them about keeping the hallways clean. You tell what, and then when everybody's had a chance to explain, then you make a decision. That's all any board of directors ever did. That's what the workers democratically will do. And don't tell me it's not workable, because the same argument was used. How can uninformed voters make a decision? We need a king. We cut the king's head off. And the decisions are not arguably any worse, and in many ways better. So let's do that. Let's finally bring democracy to the workplace. It's long overdue. That's the next stage. That's what the revolution is about. Whether we'll see it this year, next year, who knows? But nobody should say of folks like us that we only have a criticism. No, we do have a criticism. Nowadays, it's less and less necessary to justify having a criticism, since everybody is feeling the need that there be some criticism because of what's going on. But we are often charged with not having an alternative. Yes, we do, and a good one, and one that comes right out of the problems today. I don't think we solve the poverty problem without the kind of change I've talked about. And my proof, look at it. We're surrounded by poverty. We have been working, we've had wars on poverty repeatedly, every 20 years. This problem doesn't go away. In Volume 1 of Capital, Marx writes that the capitalist system has to be understood as being as successful in reproducing poverty as it is in reproducing wealth. That's right. And boy, is that a Hegelian moment.
Given that you and I in a couple of days are about to be participating in this forum about China and the United States, I think it's worth asking right now just about how you see Mao ranking among the Marxists and what his contributions were and legacy is.
Well, that's a hard one. Well, he's certainly among the important people. More, I don't mean to be unfair to him, but more because of his role. He brings sophisticated Marxism to China. I mean, you don't have to say anything else. That makes you a world historical figure of the greatest. I mean, it's stupefyingly important what he did. Number one. Number two, his political decision has shaped the world in a way not like Gramsci. Gramsci's got this corpus of work on analyzing culture. You know, Mao didn't do anything like that, not that I'm aware of. But Mao said to the Marxian tradition, of which he had become a part, that your focus on the factory, on industry, as the crucial place to organize is a mistake. It took unbelievable courage. I said, and now, as if I were Mao, it is a mistake not to understand that the rural, agricultural peasant of the world can be an equivalently revolutionary force. In Western Europe, where Marxism is born, the most reactionary part of the society were the rural, uneducated, often illiterate, religiously dragged down. And so the chances to organize revolution there were hopeless. And revolutionaries who were themselves typically urban, relatively educated, relatively, they went to work on the workers that were close to them, that they understood, from which they themselves came, the urban, industrial, and you had this split. Mao is absolutely staggeringly important because he brings the notion of Marxism and Marxist revolutionary anti-capitalist mentality to rural areas who didn't have any capital. For them, they were just beginning to deal with capitalism, and they already had this enormous push against it, which makes the evolution of places like India and China radically different from the West, where the split of agriculture and industry. I mean, Mr. Trump's base is rural, is suburban. It is not, the big cities of this country are where Mr. Trump has got a lot of problems, right? That's our culture. That's not the way it is in the East. And Mao is as much responsible for that as anybody, probably more so. So that innovation opened up Marxism to become revolutionary for what is the majority of the working class of this world, which is rural, was rural, still is rural and agricultural. And so now, India has 4 communist parties. China is ruled by a communist party. Vietnam is ruled. Mao breaks all that open and makes that a force in the world. And if I had time, I would make you the argument that what that achieved is the foundation for the Chinese economic development post-World War II. And that means that Mao is responsible in a major way for the ability of China to be a superpower challenging the United States right now. If you deal with Mao in this country, they have no idea who you're talking. I mean, the lack of an understanding of just a simple story I just told you in this country is stupefying. It's like, I don't know how to make an equivalent. It's like if that fellow over there who's working with us wanted to light a cigarette, but didn't know how to do it. And I said, here's a lighter. He would be stunned. Look at that, a thing with the fire. Whoa. And you feel for him. Oh my God, you're out of touch. We've had these lighters over 50 years. No, Mao is a bad person in China. End of conversation. And I'm talking about educated people like those at Harvard and Yale.
My Chinese teacher who's in China told me that they all really look up to him.
Yeah. For God's sake. Yes. Doesn't mean you can't disagree with this or that, or this policy, or his capacity of swimming up the Yangtze River and all the other funny stuff about him. He had that. They all do. But if the man is true, Jesus Christ, what he accomplished. I would say this to you, that the pamphlets he wrote, the history, the Long March, when they're driven out of the South, driven out of Shanghai, The early days of the Chinese Communist Party were in the cities, as was Marxism focused. And Mao was a young middle-level income family kid. And he's organizing in Shanghai, in the south of China, in the urban, with a focus on the industrial. And the government of China at the time, a nationalist government, under the heading of a man who became famous later, Chiang Kai-shek, leader, hates the communists. He is the expression of the emerging Chinese capitalist class, the entrepreneurs. Remember, China in the early 20th century is what we're talking about. This is 1920, around there, 25. It's just coming out from being a semi-colony. It was never a colony in the sense that Britain owned China the way Britain owned India. That never happened. But along the coast of China, the cities that were interesting ports were snatched by European countries. So you can think of it as China had portions of itself taken over. Hong Kong by the British. There were Portuguese, there were Spanish, French. It was horrible. And the Europeans got together and defeated the old Chinese government in something called the Boxer Rebellion, right at the beginning of the 20th century. So China was, as they now say, going through its 100 years of humiliation. That's how it's called in China. And here were some communists who were upset about it. They probably, I don't remember the detail, but certainly from a good number of them, they had left China to become students in Western Europe. They didn't come to the United States in those days. If you were a young, aspiring, middle-classy kid in China in the 20s, you went to Germany, France, probably that's, maybe England. I don't know. I know the ones about Germany because one of them became a student in Berlin and took my mother out on dates.
Oh.
Those I know. And I asked her to marry him, which she did not do, but she thought about it. She married my father, who's not that guy.
For which we are all thankful.
Yes, I hope so. Years later, my mother went to China to visit and let it be known to somebody. She didn't even remember who, but she had to get a visa and crap like that she knew Wang Ping'an, which was his name. He had by that time become a very high official in Mao's government. When the plane arrives, a black limousine, a mile long, comes out onto the runway. And as she comes down the stairs, they move her to the side. The rest of the passengers go in. She goes into the limousine, and there he is, welcoming her to China. That's why I know all this. Chiang Kai-shek murders a whole bunch of them. Sends the troops. They're having a meeting of their little, very small communist party at that time in Shanghai. I'm pretty sure it's Shanghai. And murders a lot of them. But a bunch of them escape. And they then go on a long trek, pursued by Chiang Kai-shek's military to escape. And they go deep into the interior. And that is called the Long March. If you read any history of China, there will be a chapter in the book on the Long March. Because it was in that period, it took a long time. I mean, I don't know, maybe years. I mean, the Yunnan into the deep interior of China. It's like, I don't know, if Americans had gone at some early point in the 19th century to the wilderness of northern Minnesota or something like that, just far away. And they settled among peasants in this province. And they organized the peasants against their own landlords, built a base, and that saved them from the army of Chiang Kai-shek. And there they built an alternative system, society, putting many of their principles into effect, but also, not being stupid, built an army. It's very famous in China. It's called the, I don't know the reason why, but it had the funny name, Eighth Route, 8 as in the number, Eighth Route Army. The People's, the Red Army, the Eighth Army. Then the Japanese invade China, 1931. Then there's a war between China and Japan, and Chiang Kai-shek now has to stop pursuing the communists because he can't. I mean, they're too strong now in this distant province. Fights the war with the Japanese in alliance with Mao, who's now the leader in this Yunnan. And as soon as the war is over, the Japanese are defeated. They turn on each other, and they have the Chinese Civil War, which goes from 45 to 49. Mao wins, Chiang Kai-shek loses, leaves China for the island of Taiwan with his people, which is why Taiwan is
Really?
weird. Yeah, that's how that happened.
That's the root of that.
That's all that's about. And if you want to know why the Chinese would be angry, they won a civil war. They worked together to defeat the Japanese, which they did. Chiang Kai-shek, the discredited, defeated loser of the Civil War, goes to this little island. It's like Jefferson Davis had gone to, I don't know, Staten Island and set up shop. The Chinese think that's their territory, which it is. And that it's their issue to work out, that the United States would decide that this is, that is sheer. And you couldn't possibly tell that story to the American people because it would have the effect it's having on you, which is, I didn't realize this.
The things you learn when you're an ignorant guy like me talking to Rick Wolff.
It's
you
not
learn
your fault.
Etymology, world history.
It's not your fault.
Thank you. I'd love to hear that.
No, it isn't. It isn't. It is.